Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to The Conduit. My name is Lily Blaxall. I'm the new head of programming here. This evening, we are joined by Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister, Baroness Warsi, for a conversation built around her book, Muslims Don't Matter, which was published last autumn by Little Brown, and exposes how Islamophobia has become Britain's bigotry blind spot. This evening, in conversation with the Trouble Club's Ellie Newton, Sayeeda Warsi will upend the biases that allow anti-Muslim racism to thrive in public life and policymaking, from the far-right violence of 2024 to the targeting of Muslim voices speaking up for Gaza. With social and racial equity so central to our work here at The Conduit, we are honoured to be hosting this discussion, and we invite you to join it during the audience Q&A. Please do raise your hand so we can bring you a microphone. Please also stick around after the event to buy a copy of Muslims Don't Matter, available from our friends at Stanford, just at the stall at the back, and to get it signed just at that table there. If you're a member of The Conduit, then thank you very much for being part of our community, and if you're here tonight as a guest but would like to find out more about membership, then please do visit our colleagues at the front desk. Thank you to Ellie Newton and her team at the Trouble Club for their collaboration on tonight's event. And now please do give Ellie and Sayeeda a very warm welcome to the stage.
Keep clapping as we get comfortable. There we go. Thank you very, very much. I don't think that introduction was quite complete, because actually when you were on Stand Up to Cancer, the comedy show, what was your actual title that you gave yourself?
So the title that, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, ladies
the
and
title that Nick Helm gave me, which he thought I should use as a catchphrase every time I go on stage, was, "Don't mess with me, because I'm the Baroness, bitches."
She's the Baroness, bitches, and it is so fantastic to be able to have this conversation with you tonight. There was no way I was letting that go without your full and proper introduction. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. This is such an important conversation, and this book is urgent, and it's so important. And I mean, when you finished writing it, first of all, how long did it take to write it?
12 weeks.
12 weeks, and I believe in the last week you were writing it, that's when the Southport riots happened.
I mean, literally, I'd finished writing it and handed it in to my editor, who was literally prizing it out of my hands, and then the riots happened. And I think in many ways, when I was writing the book, I was wondering whether people would understand what I was trying to say. Will they understand the arguments? Will they see what I see? Will they hear what I am asking them to hear? And those riots were the most visible manifestation of my worries. And so in many ways, I wanted to reflect that. But then the paperback, which is out this week, really deals with the aftermath of those riots and what we can learn, what we did learn, what we should have learned.
Absolutely, and it's definitely like the fate always has it that way, that if you finish writing a book, the thing that desperately needs to be included happens when you're basically supposed to have already finished it. I've interviewed a couple of MPs, and always there has to be an afterword, there has to be an addition, there has to be an extra chapter, especially when this topic is one that is so important and is so ongoing. And there are so many things to talk about and so many problems to address constantly. But for those who maybe aren't so familiar with your background, tell us about growing up. Tell us about life in Yorkshire, and one of four sisters.
One of five.
One of five.
Yeah,
Well, you had four sisters.
I had four sisters. So I was born in 1971, one of five, number two of five.
I'm two as well.
And,
second child.
Second child.
Interesting place to be.
That sense of freedom really that came with being the second child. Typical working class home. Dad was a mill worker. Mum was a homemaker. And we are born in a tiny place. We had one room downstairs, two rooms upstairs when I was born. Mum said things were looking up because Dad stopped being a mill worker and moved on to become a bus conductor, and remained a bus conductor for many years before he eventually went on to become a bus driver and then set up his own business. And then, he did incredibly well, set up another business. And, he's a typical migrant success story. And I suppose the two parts of my identity which were very strong growing up. One was this all-female home, where certainly there was a sense that we were different, and there were 5 of us because mum and dad kept trying for a boy, and so there was definitely
Your younger
a
siblings
sense.
must be really, like, when 4 and 5 must be really aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, 4 and 5, 5's definitely aware of it, and we keep reminding her of it. I'm sure we've scarred her for life off the back of it. But there was definitely, when 5 came along, there was a sense that, well, that was our last chance, and they still ended up with a female child. And I suppose some of it was, conservative societies. Some of it was even in that kind of mainstream British society, where male children were still wanted as well. And so I think that really, and then my mum really turning that into a massive chip on our shoulders by constantly telling us when we were growing up, you've got to be better than the boys. And the second thing was just this real working class sense of wanting to do better. And somehow that there was a bigger, better world out there and we wanted to be a part of it. And certainly growing up, this deep desire to fit in, to belong, to matter. And in my first book, which I wrote back in 2017 called The Enemy Within, I talk about a family that we live next door to called the Good Lads. And the Good Lads were like my image of what I wanted to be when I grew up. And what made the Good Lads so special was that the Good Lads had a greenhouse, and I thought that was like the pinnacle of success. And my mum had this little patch of scrubby land behind the garage that she used to grow her coriander and her mint in. And I just remember thinking, oh God, how uncivilized. Why can't she just have a greenhouse and grow tomatoes in it rather than this green
Strawberries
stuff?
and raspberries.
Exactly, rather than this green stuff she keeps growing behind the garden, behind the garage. Although we're now all kind of wanting to grow green stuff on a scrubby piece of land behind the garage, so how the world has changed. And the second thing the Good Lads did was every year, we never went on holiday. Mum and Dad would take us to Blackpool for the day, or we got taken to the Humber Bridge for the day, because my dad decided we needed to see the Humber Bridge when it was first opened. But the Good Lads, once a year in the summer, would pack up their caravan and go to this magical, mythical place that I thought existed somewhere called Great Yarmouth. And I remember thinking...
It is pretty magical.
Yeah, and I hope there's nobody here from Great Yarmouth. I don't agree with that, you see. I kind of went to Great Yarmouth subsequently, and I kind of thought maybe I hadn't missed out on that much.
The Humber Bridge is better, definitely.
And I suppose this real desire to fit in and to belong and to matter was just big part of growing up and wanting more, thinking there's a big world out there, and we've got to be allowed to go and get it.
Have you managed now to travel beyond the wonders of Great Yarmouth?
Well, I did go to Great Yarmouth for work once, and I remember thinking, well, maybe this wasn't the best place to go on holiday. But I think the other sense was that, well, even now, in many ways, nearly getting to the grand old age of 55, there's still this constant desire to belong, to matter, to be a part of this society. And did I think that in 2025 that is what I would still be doing? I think it kind of was that was the realization just over a year ago when I started writing this, that we're coming up to 70 years of the family's in-country relationship with Britain. I mean, of course, the out-country relationship existed for many more centuries before that, during British colonial India. But Grandad arrived here in the 50s, having served, both my maternal and paternal grandfather having served in the British Indian Army. My maternal grandfather served on the Burma front. I had a great uncle who was taken a prisoner of war. It's been fascinating that, as we've been commemorating VE Day, going through some of those old stories. He served for 25 years in the Bombay Sappers and Miners Engineering Corps. And, Dad, he came over here after the war, helped rebuild, worked in the mills. Dad worked in the mills, helped rebuild Britain after the wars. And I served at the top table in cabinet. And my only born child is now back in uniform in our armed forces. And I kind of thought, how can it be, having been part of this amazing family history of served and defended and protected and built the nation that we are today, that people are still saying to me, do you belong, do you matter? Will it protect and defend me? And that awful statement that you keep getting, and I hear ethnic minorities in public life talk about it often. I'm so grateful to be in this country, and one of the things I say in this book is I'm done. I'm done with having to be grateful for living in my own country that I helped build. I kind of feel that I don't see lots of my white friends running around saying, I'm so grateful to be living in Britain. What is the connection that we still have to be eternally grateful, eternally proving our loyalty, eternally having to, talk about how we are a part of this society? And I think there was that moment of what was happening in Gaza. We were in the run-up to the elections, the language that we were hearing, what was happening in the US. And then post-50, which you are obviously miles away from.
Closer than you'd think.
But, I don't know if any of the ladies, I wouldn't want to presume, I don't know if any of the ladies in this room are post-50, but you kind of turn post-50 and you think, I'm done. Right? I am done.
Done apologising?
I'm done with, and so the book starts with, I'm done. I'm done with apologising. I'm done with justifying. I'm done with condemning. I'm done with caveating. I'm done with being accountable for every one of the 2 billion people in the world who might have been born into the same faith as I am. I'm done with having to explain every verse of a 7th century religious text. I am done. And I think that was the kind of mindset I'd got myself into, which is probably why I managed to write it in 12 weeks.
It sounds like you vomited it, basically,
literally
out onto that page. And you've gone for the title, which you repeat throughout the book. You stress it so importantly. Muslims don't matter. We've reached a point now where Muslims don't matter. How does it feel? How did it feel just writing that throughout the book? And I'm sure discussing it with friends and family.
I mean, the first way of the first step in trying to solve a problem is saying what it is. And so I can, if you look at the way I was writing in 2017, which was much more, I would say, caveated, I think the times required a book which just had to be brutally honest. It gives me no pleasure to say Muslims don't matter. But actually, after the first 4 pages of getting it off my chest and having the emotional vomit, the lawyer in me kicks in, and then there is page after page, chapter after chapter of evidence and facts and stats and academic work and examples of how in politics and in media and in arts and in culture and in literature and in film and in law and in all aspects of it, where time and time again I show why Muslims don't matter. And I urge us to change course, because the consequences of us continuing to go down this route, and I keep saying this to some of my kind of insane colleagues in politics at the moment. I say, okay, so you can say all of this rubbish, you can whip everybody up, you can divide everybody, you can wind everybody up because it's populist. What's the end game? Right? What is the end game? What are you going to do with this community of 4 million and growing? Are you going to stick them all in a camp? Are we going to intern them somewhere? Do we think we're going to round them all up and send them off? Do we know who Muslims are? Do you realize that there isn't a Muslim kind of type, that they're black and they're brown and they're Asian and they're Persian and they're bog standard Anglo-Saxon, that John down the road actually might be Muslim? Do you realize it's a kind of the way in which you're demonizing this whole community and treating it as some sort of a single monolithic block who has these characteristics that you're placing on top of them? I mean, what's the end game?
And that question that you're asking is so powerful, because it makes you question everything you see when it comes to the statistics that you see thrown up in the media, when it comes to sport, when it comes to television, all these different areas. And you talk about having a conversation with your husband and saying, do we need to have a plan B here? Which is shocking to think that in this stage, as you say, in 2025, you're sitting there thinking, do we need to be sewing diamonds into our coats?
I mean, the first chapter is called Buying Diamonds, and it relates to a very specific conversation where we live in Yorkshire, where there's a beautiful walk from the house up to Nostell Priory.
I googled, it's very pretty.
And it's really pretty, and you should, if you ever come up to Nostell Priory, great kind of National Heritage
Near
site
Wakefield.
and National Trust site, and great coffee. And we were walking through Nostell Priory, and I said to him, I was talking about one of my siblings, and I went, so-and-so's thinking about buying overseas, and that's 3 out of 5 of us. And they talk about these homes as their plan Bs, their exit routes. Oh, when it gets really tough, we've got somewhere to go to with the kids. And I said, you and I haven't got a plan B, and we haven't got an exit route. And are we going to be like those really successful, establishment families, Jewish families in the 1930s, who could see the writing on the wall and went, oh, it's not going to happen to us, don't be so crazy. And then we were the ones that were left behind. And I said, is it time for us to have a plan B? Is it time for us to have an exit route? Is it time for us to buy diamonds? Is it time for us to sew them into our jackets? Is there going to be a quick exit? And he just said, look, if you think it's over, then it's game over. And for you to admit that and say that, you think long and hard about where this is going. And I did think long and hard about it. And I thought, I'm not prepared to accept that. And so this book was what I say, and I say it in the book, I said, I'm going to fight for my rightful place in my own country.
Quite right, for the country that your grandparents fought for, that your parents built, that your children are serving for. And that's what's clear. You're not apologizing, but we're fighting for this, because the way in which the media is turning, the way in which the narrative is moving, and it's that shifting Overton window of what is becoming acceptable. And something that I'm glad that you really pull out is the term Islamophobia, what it means, and the struggle to get an official definition. Tell us about including that.
So, the fight for equal worth and value is never easy. Ask all the women who lost their lives when, men were telling them they weren't intelligent enough to exercise the right to vote and couldn't work. And, if you were a civil servant and you got married, apparently you couldn't be both a civil servant and be married. So you had to leave your job and go and be a housewife. So ask any, community, if you want to define it like that, women, gay communities, black communities, Jewish community, ask anybody, the fight for equal value and worth is never easy. And so I don't anticipate Britain suddenly saying, oh yeah, I get anti-Muslim racism. I understand what that is. I understand how it manifests. And I understand why it needs to be dealt with. Of course, nobody's going to come along and just say that.
It doesn't exist.
Exactly.
There's no problem.
So we are starting from scraping the barrel, which is, what is, we don't like the term. We don't think it exists. We don't know what it is. You're not a race. It doesn't really happen. And so the last 10 years, 15 years have been spent saying, look at the statistics. Overwhelmingly, when you look at hate crimes, Muslim communities are at the receiving end of the majority of the hate crimes. If you look at the polling, when you poll Britain, the most negative views that people will have is about
I have it down here,
Muslim
25.9% feel negatively towards Muslims.
Yes. And all of that is kind of in the book. So I just really felt that otherwise it's just me having a moan and a rant, right?
No, it is chock full of statistics.
It had to be, exactly. I mean, the lawyer in me really had to, I kind of thought, if I'm before a court, I'm making the case here. I'm explaining
That's what
why.
this is. It's a case.
It's the case for why Muslims don't matter and why we need to do something about it. And I think that kind of that moment of trying to explain what anti-Muslim racism is, what Islamophobia is, and it is basically a form of racism which takes this tropes and stereotypes that we have about British Muslim communities, places it on the whole community, and then makes a judgment about the whole. So Muslim men are misogynistic. Muslim women are demure or downtrodden. They don't have views. That Muslims are terrorists. Muslims are extremists. Muslims are violent. Muslims are homophobic. Muslims are sexually predatory. And it goes on and on and on, right? And this is the way in which we trope this whole community. Now, do all of these features exist in some Muslims? Of course they do. But do all of these features exist in every other community? Yes, of course they do. Do you get paedophiles who are white? Yes, you do. Do you get paedophiles who are black? Yes, you do. Do you get paedophiles
Plenty. Just
who
stick
are
on the TV from a few years ago
exactly.
or walk into a church.
Exactly. Do you get paedophiles who are celebrities? Yes, you do. Do you get them in Hollywood? Yeah. Do you get them in Bollywood? Yes. Do you get them everywhere? So why are we surprised that there are paedophiles who also happen to have been born into the Muslim faith? So I think in that sense, it's breaking it down to say we take examples of the worst and then superimpose them on the whole. And that's what racism is. And how do we unpick that, and how do we check in, and what's the tests that we use to assess what that looks like.
And one of those tests is take out Muslim, put in any other religion, and how does it sound? And of course, you reference there when you're talking about the conversation you had with your husband, the experience that Jews went through before the Second World War and during the Second World War. So in terms of the word anti-Semitism, for example, and getting that kind of official word and definition from the government of Islamophobia, why is it that we do have one for anti-Semitism, we don't have one for Islamophobia? It's been a much harder fight.
Because I think for the last 14 years, we've had my colleagues in power. And because for a large part of the last 10 years, my party has been mired in allegations of Islamophobia, and because Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And so you're not going to get a party who's got hundreds and hundreds of allegations of anti-Muslim racism on its books and not dealing with them until the media got involved, suddenly to turn around and say, oh, yeah, of course, let's have this definition, because they know they're the first ones that are probably going to have to get their own house in order. But I think it's, what's fascinating is that, when you say replace the community, you could take 1930s headlines that the Daily Mail used to run about Jews and literally replace them word for the headlines they're running about Muslims. And exactly the kind of terminology that was used about, Jewish women and how Jewish people were dirty and they couldn't be trusted and they were disloyal and their men were sexually predatory. All that kind of stereotyping and tropes about Jewish communities are practically the same ones that we're now using about Muslim communities. We've just found a new bogeyman of the day. And so this isn't new. The only difference is we didn't know before what happened in the Second World War as to what the consequences are of when racism and division takes hold and the appalling consequences of that. But history has taught us what happens, so we don't need to repeat it. And yes, we have repeated it in Europe with things like the genocide in Srebrenica, but the way in which, if you look at the polling and the turning of the tide in relation to Muslim communities across the whole of Europe, and this theory of this Eurabia theory, which is, oh, the Muslims are taking over the whole of Europe and somehow this is a big conspiracy. It was very, very similar. And so what I'm saying is, let's check in on this. Let's find out how we start to unroll some of this back.
And we have the hindsight of history, and I feel like now, though, despite the fact that we have examples of where this kind of behaviour, this kind of narrative has led to such destruction and genocide, despite the fact that we have those examples to look back on and see where it went wrong, with the current way in which we live, with the media the way that it is, you can have stories like, for example, the rape gang, grooming gangs, thank you, that was kind of dragged up from several years ago because someone who happens to own X decided it was time to start talking about it. And that kind of narrative can go around the world a million times. What's it say? A lie goes around the world 80 times before the truth has even got its socks on. And the way in which that's been shifted, tell us about watching that happen and knowing that there are some people who are going to see a tweet like that and see nothing else, make a decision, come to a judgment, and then never see anything else about it.
Let's unpick that, right? Because the grooming gang scandal is a big thing that, has probably hit most people's, kind of consciousness.
Put your hand up if you're familiar with the grooming gang scandal we're talking about. There we go, yeah.
So what's interesting on all of this, and I talk about it in the final chapter, so the post-mortem, the final chapter actually comes back to this, because that's when Elon Musk kind of raised this whole issue again. Are there men who happen to be Muslim, are from the Muslim faith, who have engaged in sexually predatory behavior? Yes, they are. Have they engaged in the most vile, appalling crimes? Yes, they are. And should they be prosecuted and should they be convicted? Absolutely. And was I talking about this back in 2012, 2013 and asking government to do something about it? Yes, I was, and it's public record, and I talk about that. Some of the strongest voices over a decade ago who were asking the government to do more, and I was inside the government asking the government to do more, were myself, British Muslim, at the instigation of my father, a British Muslim man, Nazir Afzal, Crown Prosecutor, British Muslim man, chief who prosecuted much of this, Shaista Gohir, the head of the Muslim Women's Network. Time after time after time, and there was a whole series of initiatives that were done. But to somehow suggest that now, 13 years later, Elon Musk has just arrived, and these girls, nothing has been done about it, and nobody raised about it, and it's been this big dirty secret. Secondly, to suggest that somehow the police in this country were so racially aware and liberal and inclusive in light of what we've seen in the last few years, that they all sat around thinking, oh, we know that these girls are being abused, but hey ho, let's try and protect these sexually predatory men for the sake of racial harmony, is absolute bullshit. And I'll tell you why, because I was both a prosecutor and a defense lawyer in many of these areas that we worked. And the attitude of police officers, most often white police officers, when these girls walked in to make these complaints, and excuse the language, because this was the language that was used and it's been talked about in reports, they looked at them and they thought, you're white trash, I don't need to take any notice of what you have to say. You're a bad un, you come from a bad family, I know what your mum used to get up to, and we can just actually ignore you. There was a deep-rooted class issue at the heart of what was going on in the way we looked at these victims. These were not police protecting the perpetrators, this was police having no time for the victims. And the fact that we will not be honest enough to have that conversation. The third issue that was interesting in all of this was that when the Home Office actually went through and did a report on this, and went through the statistics of those that are arrested and convicted and the accusations that are being made, there is no discrepancy on race. So in terms of the percentage population of white people, percentage population of white paedophiles, percentage population of black people, percentage population of black paedophiles, percentage population of brown people, we
all have our paedophiles.
Right, we all have our paedophiles, unfortunately. And I think that when the Home Office came back with that report, 3 successive Home Secretaries refused to publish it. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, that if the report doesn't actually say what you want it to say, because it doesn't suit your rhetoric, oh, let's not just publish it. And the Information Commissioner had to become involved to force them to publish the report. And what that report showed was that tragically, overwhelmingly, most children are abused in the home. Most children are abused by a father, an uncle, a brother, a stepbrother, family friendship circle. Overwhelmingly, the statistics are there. That child abuse has been an issue in all societies and was in this country long before brown and black people arrived on these shores. And that wherever there is power alongside vulnerability, whether that's in the church, in other religious organizations, in sports clubs, in Hollywood, on TV, anywhere, politics, wherever you find power alongside vulnerability, men, and it is tragically most often men, will abuse. And to somehow suggest that actually, no, we don't have an issue with anything else, this is the only one we want to talk about, because the perpetrators allow us to sell a divisive story, which allows us to... And when you actually sit down and say, well, let's have this conversation, unfortunately, politicians aren't interested. And especially when I see my colleagues in the shadow cabinet now standing up and making an issue about this, I kind of think, where have you been for the last 14 years? I'll tell you where you've been. We've been in government. Why did you choose not to do anything about this stuff that you now so care about? Have you suddenly now just developed a conscience, or is it because it's a useful tool for populist campaigning?
Absolutely. It is completely frightening. And then to flip it on its head, because if you're going to see information about crime and Muslims in the media, it tends to be this idea that there is an overpopulation, they overrepresent when it comes to these kinds of crimes. But actually, what we're not talking about is whether or not people feel safe going to and from the mosque. And tell us about those statistics and why we're not seeing them in the media.
Yeah, I mean, there was this... moment, Muslims are only of interest when they're perpetrators, not when they're victims. Muslim heroes don't exist. There was a tragic case in Leicester Square, actually, not so long ago, where a woman and her child were attacked, but they were stabbed, and there was a Muslim security guard who stepped in and protected them. His Muslimness was never talked about. The only time he was talked about was when Tommy Robinson accused him of being a Hamas supporter. He then subsequently had to withdraw that because there was a potential legal case against him, and he had to withdraw that accusation. The second thing is, you remember the stabbing in Sydney, in the shopping centre, where a man from the incel movement went on a rampage stabbing women. Again, there was one person who was killed in that. The person who was killed was a Muslim man who stepped in to protect those women. Again, you'll never hear about that. 3 grandfathers were were killed on our streets in 3 separate incidents. Each one of them at some point was linked to or accused of by the perpetrator. By the way, not in real life, there was no connection to them, but each time the perpetrator decided to act because he thought he wanted to take revenge for groomers. These were grandfathers simply living their lives, going about their business. And you won't hear about them. You won't even know their names. I talk about them. I say you'll never remember their names. And so this narrative of the way in which we frame the Muslim experience is very, very, very deliberate, despite what the statistics say, despite overwhelmingly showing that attacks on Muslims. It's a single community that receives the largest number of hate attacks.
And have those individuals that you pointed out often being accused of, being Hamas supporters, being ISIS sympathizers, you take out, there's a very powerful phrase where you talk about you being accused of being an ISIS sympathizer while you're on an ISIS death kill list.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in government, I was Privy Councillor, I used to sit in Cabinet, I was on the National Security Council, and we had a terrorist attack on the streets of London. Drummer Lee Rigby was killed. And at the time, I was part of the team on the National Security Council that responded to that. And a right-wing commentator wrote, he now appears on the BBC and is apparently considered to be respectable, Douglas Murray, wrote in which he said, how can Britain deal with the war on terror when we have her, the enemy, at the table? And what that basically said was, you are not one of us. You can't be trusted. And, for all the things that have been said over the years, that moment of realizing that even when you were sat at the cabinet table, you are still an outsider. Even when actually you are a Privy Councillor, so therefore you've been cleared to have access to the highest level of intelligence.
There are the nuclear codes and everything.
Exactly. There are still people out there who will still shout that at you. And subsequently, it was followed up a couple of years later with an article, I think in the Times or the Telegraph, written by Andrew Gilligan, who, interestingly, the Times decided to use to review my book because they couldn't find anybody better.
And then I like that, obviously, when you get the extra chapter, you get to review the reviewers. Most people don't get to do that.
Reviewers. And he basically said that somehow there was this Islamist cell at the heart of government, and I was like chief Islamist in charge of it all. I just think I must be the shittest sleeper cell in history. The number of times I had the Prime Minister and Her Majesty in the same room and Homeland type, I never went off. I kind of think, at what point do you kind of allow the stupidity of this to sink in? And the fact that government had to issue letters to every one of those people who were part of this Islamist terrorist, Islamist cell, they had to issue letters to each of these individuals to say that this article is absolute nonsense, there's no basis to it, and those people still travel with that letter in case they get stopped for a Schedule 7 stop at airports. This is the way they damage people's lives. And, the tragedy of all of this was that there was an article written about me in which I was accused of being an ISIS sympathizer. The article was published tragically in the Jewish News. And I said to them, this is rubbish, can you take it down? And we got into a standoff about it. And this was published at a time when I was on the ISIS kill list, one of 9 people in this country who were on an ISIS kill list for a number of years. And in the end, it took legal action. It took legal action for them to withdraw the article, issue an apology, and issue and give damages, which I donated to charity. And I think that sense that Muslims in public life are fair game, that they can throw whatever rubbish they can at you and at some point it will stick and it will damage your reputation. This process of damaging people's reputation and their futures is something that consistently happens.
And how have you, going throughout your career, because you have been attacked from so many, from roughly the same side, from the ever-growing, becoming more and more hideous right-wing media that we have in this country, how do you let it kind of just roll off your back and know that you just got to keep going?
Because I think going back to the very first question that you asked me, I'm one of 5 girls born into a place where probably you were told that, you were not as good as the boys, and by the time I started fighting these nutters, I'd been fighting all my life. You know, I've been preparing all my life.
Credit your
this,
sisters.
Yeah, exactly. From the day I was born, I was fighting for equal worth and value. And so I think in some ways, yes, a lifetime of fighting various battles. Secondly, I think a sense that these battles are never going to be easy, and you know we're going to have to step up. And
proper battles never
then,
are.
Yeah, and if not me, then who? And also humor. Like humor is I constantly used to wind my colleagues up and say, you know, for many of you who might think, you know, when I was overseas for a while, I was on my jihadi gap year, you know, preparing for this moment of entering government. I mean, humor is the only way sometimes that you can cope with this. But I think in this book, you know, maybe the humor ran out. And that's when I turned around and said, I'm done. I'm done with having to keep trying to educate you because you refuse to understand that everybody has equal worth and value.
Despite the hideous number of Islamophobia that comes out of the Tory party and the investigations that have been done, and you really tear apart some of those investigations and how terribly they were done, you're still very much a Tory, very, very much a Conservative. Will that always be the case?
I've been a member of the Conservative Party for nearly 3 decades. I mean, it's such a big part. It's some sort of weird kind of toxic Stockholm syndrome, clearly. But it's...
I think you talk about it as being a toxic relationship.
It is a toxic relationship. I mean, it's... I am a centre-right, one-nation Conservative. And I always try and remind people of the cabinet that I sat around the table. You know, if I look to my left and right, there was Ken Clarke, Dominic Grieve, David Willits, Justine Greening, William Hague. Good, decent human beings. Even when you disagreed on policy, they were thoughtful. There was a level of decorum, decency, behaviour that you expected. And the challenge that I have with the current Conservative Party is that it's not a Conservative Party. It's some sort of weird reform-light populist party. And either it needs to go full-on reform, you know, and say, well, that's who we actually are, and then leave space for the development of a genuine centre-right Conservative Party, or it needs to stop, you know, channeling reform and come back and be who we are, which is a one-nation centre-right, you know, economically sound, decent, law-abiding, patriotic party. And we've lost so much of that. You know, I campaigned for the party in the mill towns in Yorkshire, you know, I mean, in the dark days. But and people, you know, there was some parts of the country that absolutely despised and hated us. But there were certain things that you could always stand back on and say, well, you know, are we the party, you know, we could say, well, we're the party of sound money. And well, Liz Truss put that to bed. Yeah. You know, we're the party of law and order. Well, Boris Johnson put that to bed. You know, and we're the party of patriotism, and Kemi Badenoch's putting that to bed. Freedom. With all this populism. Yeah, exactly. What are we becoming? And unfortunately, I think we're going to be in the wilderness for a while, but me and lots of others like me are hanging in there for the day that we can drag them back into the centre ground.
Absolutely. I think many people are waiting for that day. I did just want to touch on a really fascinating part of the book that especially because when there are particular individuals involved. But you talk about Shamima Begum and what she went through in terms of having her citizenship stripped. And for those who saw it, engaged with the story, I don't think they realised that it was presented to them in such a way that meant actually this citizenship stripping is just not something that really happened before a few years ago.
I mean, the thing about Shamima Begum is whether she's a sinner or a saint, she's our sinner or our saint. She's not Bangladesh's sinner or saint. And what we did with Shamima Begum was we took a 15-year-old girl who'd been groomed online, who went out to commit whatever she committed out there. And at the end of when ISIS collapsed, when so many male fighters returned to this country, and we have lots of them here in this country, and the women and children were left behind, the women and children became easy targets for us not to allow back in. Even though we knew that people far more dangerous had made their way back. And we made an example of her And in doing so, we put out the message that there is now, to quote, of all people, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who said that we now have two classes of citizenship in this country. And the basis upon which we stripped her of her citizenship, because in this country we're not allowed to make anybody stateless. So the basis upon which we stripped her of her citizenship was to say that she could possibly, probably, somewhere have a right to apply, have an option to apply for a Bangladeshi citizenship. And a country that she'd never been to, she wasn't born in, she hadn't visited. But the option ran out at the age of 21. So if she didn't exercise her option to apply for, not be granted, option to apply for a Bangladeshi citizenship by the age of 21, she would then not have been allowed to have her citizenship stripped. And so we made sure that before she hit her 21st birthday, we stripped her of her citizenship, and we said, oh, she's Bangladesh's problem, even though Bangladesh said, had she exercised that option, she would not have been granted that citizenship. So through a kind of sleight of hand, we made her stateless. And in doing so, we sent out this message that if you are called Mary Jane with blonde hair and blue eyes, and your heritage is Anglo-Saxon, so you've been here for a few hundred years, and you commit crime X, you will not have your citizenship stripped. But if you call Shamima Begum, and you're brown-eyed and dark-haired, and your heritage is Bangladeshi, you will have your citizenship stripped. We basically hammered the concept that we are all equal before the law. We gave one set of punishment for somebody of a certain heritage and a separate set of punishments for somebody of a different heritage. And what it means for nearly, I think that the last assessment, somebody said 12 million people fall foul of this in our country. 12 million people in this country are now in a vulnerable position of having their citizenship stripped. And this is personal for me, because out of those 12 million, that includes my kids. Kids with a 70-year history and heritage in this country, kids with hundreds of years of heritage and history and connection to Britain before then, and it also includes my child who is currently in uniform in our armed forces. That is when it hits home, and it makes you realize that this is such a terrible injustice of our times, when we made a decision based purely on our prejudice, not on our principles.
And all you have to do, yes, thank you, whoever's here in the audience, all you have to do is look at our prisons of rapists and murderers who will never have to worry about having their citizenship revoked, because if they were, as you say, if they're called John, and they happen to have committed one of the worst atrocities you can imagine in this country, that isn't being held over their head. That's not a threat. And
I grew up in Yorkshire when the Yorkshire Ripper, as they used to call him, was loose. I mean, I remember as a child being absolutely petrified walking home. And Peter Sutcliffe, who, raped and mutilated and killed and attacked numerous women, multiple women over multiple years. The Moors murderers, we never stripped any of these of their citizenship. The most heinous crimes have been committed in this country. And even though the concept of citizenship stripping has been on our statute books for over 100 years, we never used it. We never used it in, we never used it post the Second World War. We never used it in the Thatcher years. We never used it. This simply became something that we used in targeting this particular community.
Absolutely. It's a two system, as you talk about, a two system. And another area where you lay this out really well, because it hit news when it happened to one bloke, debanking. Yeah. Hits Nigel Farage, we all hear about it. We all hear if Nigel Farage loses his bank account. But this is something that Muslims in this country go through all the time.
Debanking for Muslims has been happening for about 15 years. Lots of individuals, organisations, institutions have had their bank accounts withdrawn.
Charities, Muslim charities.
And then the trustees, and then the kids of those trustees. Whole families have been left debanked and unbanked. And this has been raised multiple times with banks. It's been raised by ministers. Nobody's taken any notice of it. Nobody was interested. And yet when Coutts Bank decides that old Nigel didn't have enough money to have a fancy Coutts Bank account and therefore had to settle for a normal one like the rest of us, whoa, the furore. The Prime Minister got involved. We had an inquiry, heads rolled, people lost their jobs. We ended up having to have the Financial Conduct Authority involved. We wanted to change the rules. Why? Why is it that when Nigel is debanked, we make such an issue out of it, but when dozens and dozens and dozens of Muslims are debanked, well, they don't matter? And that's the kind of specifics that I go into in the book to say, look, time and time again, there is this different treatment when it comes to this community as opposed to the rest of us.
And it's these things that you wouldn't even think about, and that's where the book becomes so shocking, because there are some things, you know, for example, the case of Shamima, where it is something that's out there, but this is something where you think, okay, I've never heard about this. And having a bank account, it's one of those essential things. You can't run a charity. You can't have a job in this country unless you have a bank account. The idea that you could have lose your citizenship, lose your bank account. And as you talk about, we need to and should be putting ourselves out there to be a really good place financially for Muslims to come and do business, because that is only in our best interest.
I mean, I think it's the way in which all aspects of your life are at the mercy of whoever the decision maker is, and that's what it's starting to feel like. And the worrying thing for me is that the exodus really of successful British Muslims is of huge proportions at the moment. So many people are now making a decision not to stay. So many of them are encouraging the kids to go out and work somewhere else. Canada, New Zealand, Malaysia, you know, all sorts of places around the world are now being considered to be options. And this is not the way it needs to end.
I want to touch on, as we're coming towards the end, I wanted to touch on film and representation within, I suppose, TV and film. You mentioned a test for seeing whether or not Muslim representation on screen is acceptable, is fair. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, it's the Riz test. So Riz Ahmed, who many of you will know as a very successful Hollywood actor, somebody created off the back of the work that he'd done, you know, the Riz test. You know, is when you turn on the television, is the Muslim depiction a terrorist? Is the Muslim depiction, you know, I mean, you know, is the Muslim woman this kind of subdued woman who's been subjected to domestic violence, or is she an exotic belly dancer? You know, there's these extremes of the way in which Muslims are represented on the screen. And how are they a passive part of the main story? You know, American Sniper, for example, are they just people that are seen through targeted lenses? Is their story being told? Are they an active participant? So the Riz test is a really good way of looking at how TV, culture, arts, you know, describe Muslim communities and stereotype Muslim communities. And it's happening in Hollywood, it's happening in Bollywood. I go through the various kind of films that do that. And also the fact that the CIA have got their fingers all over this. There's a specific unit within the CIA, this is all documented, who fund, support, frame the narratives that they want these films to be putting out. And this is done drip, 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 drip over a number of years. Is it any wonder then that whole, you know, generations grow up thinking, oh, okay, so that's what Muslims are about then?
They're the bad guys.
They're the bad guys.
That's the really terrifying thing. And I guess throughout the book, the theme that really hits home throughout everything is the constant double standards. And you made one I thought was really interesting, because as you often say, you touched on how Muslim women are depicted on screen. Demure, often quiet, not having a major role to play. But when you look at, for example, a quality like modesty, our late Queen often heralded, and that being a good quality, but it's not when it comes to Muslim women.
I always say that the kind of characteristics that, you know, we talk about in Muslim women, you know, where they're kind of, mainly stiff upper lip, you know, modesty in the way in which they dress, family is really important, duty is really important, all the qualities that we admired in Her Late Majesty are the very qualities that you see in so many Muslim women, but, you know, nice headscarf. But somehow we don't like
headscarf, you know.
Yeah, nice headscarf, but we
Headwear.
don't, but yet we love those qualities in Her Late Majesty. We just but yet in Muslim women we see them as negative. And what I also find fascinating is there are colleagues in politics who like to save Muslim women, right? They like to campaign alongside Muslim women as long as they're campaigning about Muslim men. And they like to campaign alongside Muslim women on the fact that they've been so badly treated by Islam and Muslim men. And they want these women to be outspoken and bold and opinionated and brave. And then I come along and I'm sticking their throat. And all those things that you think, well, you want Muslim women to be brave and bold and outspoken. And
here I am.
Yeah, here I am, I've arrived. I am the real deal. Oh, no, not you. No, not you. Because we don't want you to look at us and tell us what we're doing wrong. We want you to smack down on Muslim communities, because the only time we want to support you is when you're saying bad things about the communities you come from. Because unfortunately, we've now reached a place in politics where, as a politician of colour, to punch down and pander to racism is career enhancing. To call it out is career ending.
Absolutely. My goodness. I mean, and also I should say this book is full of so many incredible phrases, it was just brilliantly written as well, I should say. So thank you very much. It was a real privilege to read it for this. Sport. Because I remember so clearly when the Qatar World Cup was happening, the fury around the fact that it was being hosted in the first place, the digging into the ways in which the stadiums were being built, many fair comments. And then you talk about Beijing Olympics, nothing along those lines.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how different human rights abusers around the world are seen in a completely different way. Do I think that there were real challenges around human rights abusers in the building of the stadiums in the run-up to the Cup? Absolutely. Do I think that there are limitations in the way in which LGBT communities can exist within Qatar? Completely. But the furore we had over the Qatar World Cup, and I did actually remind us that the last time we hosted the World Cup, by the way, homosexuality was a crime in Britain. So, you know, we were in that place when we were hosting the World Cup, and now they're on their journey. But the way in which it was kind of framed was just, and the way in which we didn't see those abuses in China, we didn't see those abuses in Russia, we didn't see those abuses in anywhere else in the world, but here we had to make a real kind of focus on it. And I think it's this constant thing. Do not use human rights. We cannot use human rights as a stick with which to beat people that we want to beat. But when it comes to our allies, we just shelve it. Either human rights matter, and they matter for all of us in all communities, and we hold ally and enemy accountable for human rights abusers, or they don't matter, and then stop pretending they do. Because we can't have the hypocritical use of human rights without the genuine application of them, because they're a part of who we are.
Absolutely. And then I suppose to come to what you could say in terms of news at the moment is quite an obvious double standard, is the way in which we look at a conflict in Ukraine versus a conflict in Gaza. Tell us about, I suppose, the last couple of years and watching these two conflicts be covered and how they've been addressed differently.
I mean, it goes much further back than that. I resigned over the issue of Gaza in 2014. Exactly, actually, for the kind of concerns that I'm raising now, because at the time I kept trying to ask my colleagues, look, we have a policy and we have values, but we're neither implementing our policy nor implementing our values. So what is it that we're actually doing in the middle of this last kind of episode of violence in Gaza? And, you know, I ask the same question now. You know, we have a policy, we're not applying it. We have values, we're not applying it. We have public opinion, we're not applying it. We have our own interests, we're not implementing it. And it doesn't make sense. And then specifically in more recent times, the different way in which we dealt with refugees from Ukraine, the way in which people were encouraged to open up their homes, the way in which we asked children to come here to be educated, and yet from Gaza we wouldn't even allow children here to be treated for medical needs. It has taken 19 months, ladies and gentlemen, to bring 2 children from Gaza to be treated. 2. It took a change in government, it took 2 governments, it took a massive effort, it took completely private funding, it took some of the most senior doctors at places like Great Ormond Street to finally convince the government to allow in 2 children. And it kind of puts things into perspective, and the way in which the language that was used of hate marchers, Islamists, extremists, all of that stuff, anti-Semites, that was used about people protesting on the streets of London by the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, when she was in office. She knew that if she said that those people on our streets were made up of Muslims and Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and people of no faith, that those people were black and white and all backgrounds and, you know, all ethnicities, and they were coming together because they had concerns and they wanted to raise their voice in relation to what was going on in Gaza. Well, she didn't say that. She had to make those marchers Muslims. And the reason she had to make those marchers Muslims is because the quickest way you demonize a group of people and you demonize a cause is to make it Muslim, because Muslims don't matter.
Have you been in any way, I suppose, made to be optimistic by, I suppose, the way in which the online world, especially younger people, have been talking about what's going on in Gaza online?
I think not just in relation to Gaza, but in relation to all the issues that I raise in the book. Time and time again, what we found was that much of the poisoning of the public discourse wasn't bottom up, it was top down. That actually people were responding to newspapers and think tanks and politicians, that there was this deliberate dog whistle politics that was being done, that people were, I always say there's a lovely place in Yorkshire called Harrogate. It's the kind of place everybody wants to go retire to. It's where Betty's Tea Room is, and it's just the most wonderful kind of place to go and live, and I always say that if we opened up a channel called Harrogate TV, and every week we publish story after story after story of whose cars had been scratched, whether there'd been a theft, whether, you know, something bad had happened in Harrogate, we would trash Harrogate's reputation within a few months. If all we did was we focused on making it our job to tell people how bad Harrogate was. Right, we'll superimpose that, GB News Muslims. You've got it daily basis. And again, I talk about the academic work that's been done to show the way in which GB News talk about Muslims, the way in which the number of times they mention it, the stories that are being told. So this is quite deliberate, right? This is, and that's what, and yet when you look down at ordinary people, the daily kind of encounters that people are having in their lives is very, very different. And also in terms of our popular culture, you know, whether it's Nadia Begum on Bake Off, or whether it's Hamza Yassin on Strictly, or whether it's Asma on Sewing Bee, or whether it's, you know, Saliha on MasterChef.
All the best British TV shows,
exactly.
yeah.
All the popular culture moments, every one of them at some point has been worn by a Muslim. So when ordinary people connect with ordinary Muslims, there isn't an issue. But when people are constantly being told what to think about Muslims and are fed this narrative, that's where the poisoning starts. And so one of the things I urge in the book is to say that just like post-Southport, when communities took over their streets and said, not in our name, you don't get to do this, we have to take back this narrative. We have to build community. We have to be prepared to say we're going to protect our local communities, that the glue that binds us on a local level in the end is what will stem the poisonous tide that's being fed from the top.
Absolutely. We're going to come to questions in just a second, so get thinking of them. I suppose my final question, because it happened quite recently, is what did you think when Starmer said we're becoming an island of strangers?
I genuinely think it was a cock-up, not a conspiracy. I genuinely think, however easy it would be for me to say, oh, you know, I don't think and I'd like to think, I don't think he did, and I don't think anybody in Downing Street thought, oh, you know, it's a really good moment for Keir Starmer to channel his inner Enoch Powell. I don't think that was where they were going with this. There's a second part to this speech. I know that from speaking to colleagues in the Labour Party, which is the second part of it, which is how do we build community, and how do we make sure we're a stronger, more resilient nation. And I think the timing of it wasn't great. I think the language used wasn't great. I think the fact that they only did one half of it and not the other half wasn't great. And I genuinely think it was a cock-up.
Okay. I lied. I have one more question. You talk at the beginning, and you've touched on it, that Muslims are genuinely looking at a plan B. They're looking at leaving Why would that be? Tell us why that would be so incredibly devastating for our nation, for our sense of community and freedom, the rule of law, and all that goes with it.
Look, there's a selfish interest, and there's a whole section in there about why persecution is bad for business, right? Persecution is bad, generally.
You are a, small conservative
exactly.
at the end of the
Small
day.
But it's also bad for business. And historically, whenever you've looked at communities, the most diverse, multi-religious communities are usually the most economically successful communities. And, whatever you say about the Commonwealth, and there's lots of bad things that we can say about it. There was a diversity and a vibrancy that came with being connected to so many different parts of the world, and they're being connected to us. And the Muslim community are overwhelmingly a young community. 50% of them are, I think, under the age of 25 at a time when increasingly we're going to need younger legs, younger arms. We're going to need a workforce. They're entrepreneurial. Lots of them struggle with getting jobs and set up businesses. It's a hyper-diverse community with super connections around the world. Amazing work and boundaries that they're pushing on arts and on culture and in business and in entrepreneurship. So lots to kind of give, and they will give in the coming years. I always say, to purpose a phrase for better use, Muslims are going to make Britain great again. But I also think that there's another side to all of this, and that's the personal side to this. It's the fact that you can't plan anything. It's the fact that you spend almost on a daily basis thinking, where are we going to be in 20 years' time? It's the fact that I cannot guarantee that my grandkids are going to grow up here. I can't guarantee where they're going to end up. I don't know what that world is going to look like for them, how difficult it's going to be for them. And I can't honestly, hand on heart, sit with my kids and my grandkids and say, this is where it's going to be, and how reluctantly one of our children has moved overseas, and how reluctantly we are starting to accept that more of them will too. And we have stopped telling them to stay. Because I can't, hand on heart, say, you're going to be safe, you'll be good. And therefore, should we at least give them the opportunity to create a life elsewhere? And that, for me, I did an event at the Bank of England, and the governor of the Bank of England said to me, do you think that some people, turn on the television and hear you going on about this stuff again and think, oh my God, there's Baroness Warsi droning on about anti-Muslim racism. And I said, do you not think that I wake up every morning and think, oh my God, there's Baroness Warsi droning on about anti-Muslim racism? I said, I am tired. I would love to wake up tomorrow. I said to him, I would love to wake up tomorrow and be a straight white man and never have to worry about this again, ever. We're both coming up to, my husband and I are coming up to 55. We've been incredibly lucky and worked incredibly hard and have been huge social mobility success stories. We've started out as these working class kids who now live in the nice part of town and ski in the right resorts, right? So we have been a massive success story. And this is the time where it would be nice just to put my feet up and sit on a beach somewhere. This is not a fight I want to fight. These are supposed to be our good years, not our years worrying about what happens next. So, yeah, I think that Britain will be poorer, and my family and we will be poorer if our future generations decide not to make Britain their home.
Thank you so much for that very powerful message, and for writing this book, and for for the fight that you're doing, because it is so urgent. It's so important that people read this. We are going to come to questions, so if you have one, stick your hand up nice and high, and we're going to give you a microphone so that everyone at home can hear it. We've got a question right down here at the front and up here, but we'll start down here. It's coming your way, don't worry. Go for it.
Hi there. Ever since I saw you on Stand Up for Cancer, I've been such a fan.
A fan. She's going to do some comedy afterwards, don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. If you ever win the battle, please become a stand-up. But my question is, I saw this rather strange suggestion that the government was going to publish crime statistics by nationality. And it just struck me as such an odd thing to do, and I wonder if you've got any view on why they might be wanting to do this and whether it's a good thing.
I think the government's got itself into a little bit of a kind of reform paranoia at the moment, and I think the last local elections haven't helped. But the thing I keep reminding people of, having spent lots of years fighting organisations like the British National Party, is that you can't ever out-fascist the fascists, right? And so unless you're prepared to go full on, fascist, it's not going to work. And so we're never, ever going to be more extreme right than the far right. And the Labour Party really need to understand that with what it's trying to do, for every vote that it's trying to get on the right, it's probably losing 2 on the left. And so where does it end up? For me, there's a fabulous book written by Renier Lodge, actually. If any of you haven't read it, you should. It's called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And one of the things she says in a book is that why is it that when a white man commits a crime, he's just a criminal, I paraphrase, but when a black man commits a crime, it's somehow a reflection of his blackness. And that's what I don't understand. If we're going to publish these statistics and it turns out that, 90% of burglaries are committed by white people or white men, are we then going to say, oh, wow, you can't trust white people anymore because they commit burglaries? Probably not, but I tell you one thing, if we come back with a statistic which says something like 40% of knife crime is committed by black boys, we will say that's a reflection of their blackness and we'll make it an issue about them. And this is what I worry about. What is this being done for? A crime is a crime is a crime. And what we should be dealing with is criminals, not the ethnicity of the criminals, because, are we saying that there is something quite unique about ethnicity or race that it makes people more or less criminal? Because what does that then say about, say, Britain 100 years ago, where you didn't have many black people and brown people? Are we saying there was no crime?
I think it's actually about nationality. That's why it's so peculiar.
I'm not sure what they mean by that, because I presume what they're looking at is foreign criminals then. If they're looking at people who might not be British nationals, and whether they're going to then use that as a way of dealing with punishment which looks more towards stripping them of their right to remain in this country. I just think it becomes quite complicated when you go down that route. Who knows where it might land?
Thank you very much. Great question. We think we have a question just over here. Lady with the laptop, taking notes. Love to see it.
Yes, absolutely. I work in the field of conflict resolution and management, and this is why I'm here with it, because I'm working on a project along those lines. Thank you, first of all. It was amazing to hear you. So you're talking about a growing big problem, which actually is about deep loss and trust between communities, between several communities. So do you believe community dialogue and public engagement can help build trust? And if so, if yes, if your answer is yes, then what kind of support or education do policymakers, faith leaders and civil society need? Where are the blind spots?
Yeah. So one of the things I normally say when I do these events, which I actually haven't said today, is I usually start by saying that nothing is off the table today. There are no no-go areas. There is no question that you can't ask me. There is nothing that's going to offend me, as long as we do it in a way which is civilized and civilizing and in the interests of learning. And I don't think we're having enough of these conversations where we're sitting down and in the interests of learning, having a genuine, respectful, two-way conversation where we're allowed to talk about really difficult things. David Baddiel and I do a podcast called A Muslim and a Jew Go There. And one of the reasons why we do that is because often we find that with Muslim and Jewish communities, we don't talk, we sit there and we have happy, clappy conversations about whatever, samosas and cups of tea, but we don't have the difficult conversations. So I do think we need to have a place where difficult conversations or conversation can take place. I love the old-fashioned big town hall discussions, and it's not shock jock journalism on places like GB News. It's got to be done in a spirit of learning. The other thing is when I was in government and during the austerity programme, most often the Department for Local Government and Local Government and Communities would be the first one to be hit with cuts, and the communities programs would be cut, and we haven't had a cohesion program in government for a decade. And so are we surprised that we don't have cohesive communities because we've stripped away all those places and spaces where people would have got along and mixed, and we don't have those spaces anymore. So there is a space for the state to create the places and spaces where people can mix. I also think there's a responsibility on us to start thinking about the kind of society that we want to be. I'm involved in a project called Project 2040, which is run by predominantly Muslim charities, and it comes from an Islamic teaching about being responsible for 40 people to your left and 40 people to your right. The teaching is that you can't eat that night if 40 to your left and 40 to your right sleep, if anyone in those families sleeps hungry. And it's the teachings around building community, and building community is a basic Islamic requirement. It's your job to look after the communities in which you live. By the way, not Muslim, communities in which you live, whatever person whatever background they happen to be. And so part of this is, how do we educate a nation of young people who are now 4 and 5 and who will be coming of age in 2040, who become the nation's community builders. And it's a difficult sell, because at a time when a lot of Muslims feel like their backs are up against the wall, that they need somebody to reach out to them, we're saying to them, no, use this moment to reach out and help the communities in which you are in. So I think we've got to make community and family cool again. And I know we've had this whole kind of period of you do you, and it's all about you, and you're going to be happy, and it's all about well, yeah, fine, okay, we've done that bit. But actually, human beings flourish when they work and live in communities, when they have human contact. There's great satisfaction and happiness that comes from doing good and from just daily human contact. And one of the things I say, and it might sound a bit twee, right? Randomly talk to strangers, which is difficult down in London, right? Because they all look at you and go, weirdo alert, you know. Whereas actually in the north, you know, we do it quite normally. So one of the things
that's why we're so terrified to go up north.
I call it, yeah, one of the things that there's this whole thing that there's a whole bunch of us that we do, which is called buy back the coffee. And what that basically means is, when you're at the coffee thing and you say, I'd like so-and-so, you turn around and you say, what would you like? And in Yorkshire, they say, oh, you don't have to do that, love. And I say, no, I'll get you coffee. And they'll ask there for the tea or coffee. You buy them a coffee, you have a small interaction, you walk away. Brilliant feeling, right? Buy somebody a coffee. You do that in London and it's like, whoa. Is she hitting?
What are you saying?
Is she hitting on me? Does she want why was she buying me a coffee? Was she gonna? No, why are you buying? You don't need to do it. So we have this awkwardness. We're slowly getting there. I've succeeded in London a few times now for buying somebody a coffee. But it's the ordinary, everyday interaction with strangers, which we did so well in COVID. You know, when we were all cooped up and we were allowed that time out to go have a little walk, and we met people randomly that we'd never met before. It's like, hi, how you doing? You know, we were ever so like random stranger talking because we needed contact. We need to start building communities. We need to start feeling like we are responsible for people more than ourselves. You know, we've got to start moving out of this concept of, and it is, look, I'm sorry, there is a moment of self-indulgence that we've got into in the Western world where it's all about us. It's not all about us. We've never as human beings existed in that way. We've existed in larger communities. So I think there has to be a push towards people starting to talk about what society, community, responsibility looks like. And it's probably not going to be very fashionable in the early days, but we do need to start rebuilding that. It's something I teach my kids. So one of the things I say to my kids is, you're privileged. They are privileged. They didn't grow up like we grew up. You know, we were like crawling and scraping for every single bit that we went through. They've been brought up with privilege. So I say, okay, so you come with privilege. What do you therefore do in return for that privilege? And how do you make sure you look after communities around you? And so whether it's you do the litter pick, you check in on local, on your neighbours, you make sure you volunteer at the local food bank, you just have a nice word to say to the homeless people you meet on your way to work, wherever it is, small or big, or you start to go off and run a massive charity, whatever it is, small or big, do that deed every single day. Because if you're not doing that good deed to make the world a better place every single day, what is your purpose? We're not put on this earth, without purpose. There is a purpose to us being here. Whether you're religious or not, there is a purpose to this. So live life with purpose, and that means building community.
Amazing. That was fantastic. I'm following you to Starbucks after this. I want to be next in line. We probably have time for one more quick question. We have a gentleman just here. Coming just behind you. Look to your right. There you go. Go for it.
I think you're so over this question, so I'm rather hesitant to ask it. But phobia comes from ignorance, right? I mean, fear is bred in ignorance. And I just wondered if you had something to say about the complexity of Islam and you know, the Shia strand and the Sunni strand and the Sufi strand and how that ties into individual countries' cultures. And is that a question, you know, is that a helpful question to say, where is the education about the complexity of Islam going to help and who's going to be responsible for it, so that we don't have this ghastly alliance with, you know, Muslims are really proto-ISIS people, and the thoughtful press is saying actually a lot of ISIS are just angry, you know, disaffected men who want to know how to build a bomb, you know, as in the Southport trope about the guy who came from, you know, the young man who committed this awful atrocity, and the rumor went around that he was Muslim, whereas in fact he came from Catholic Rwandese parents, but was also British. And I'm passionate about this because that type of lazy thinking, which is driven by very difficult, divisive media, you know, it affects my wider family and some really quite intelligent people who, if you challenge them, they start really getting very agitated, and the tone of their voice changes. So, long question, but you know, the complexity of Islam. Whose responsibility is that for us to avoid that monolithic type of? Is that a helpful question? It may not be.
I think it's a fascinating question for a number of reasons.
Challenging one to end on.
First of all, because I think the complexity of every religion is fascinating, and every religion, I mean, if you think about the hundreds and hundreds of years of wars in European soil, you know, and if you think about the challenges in relation to Catholicism in the United Kingdom, and we question their loyalty.
I mean, the troubles in NI.
Yeah, exactly. We question their loyalty, and, you know, the fact that we thought they were loyal to a papacy overseas, and we wouldn't allow them to go to Oxford and Cambridge, and we wouldn't allow them to become members of Parliament, and, you know, and yet they were all supposed to be the same religion, right? Different versions of it. And if you look at the various denominations of Christianity and if you look at the various denominations of all religions, the problem is not the complexities of a religion. And I find that fascinating because I come from a mixed Sunni Shia background. The official word is sushis. We are sushis. So, you know, I come from
Tasty.
a sushi family. Exactly. I come from a sushi family, which is kind of really interesting in the way that we were brought up in a very pluralistic way. The problem is not religion. The problem is the politicization of religion. And we've seen the politicization of religion when we've seen it in Europe. We've seen the politicization in the West, in the extremist settler movement, where you've got a whole load of people who think Judaism and the religious text is some sort of geography book, and they were promised this land by God 2,000 years ago, and there's no stopping them from thinking that because they're completely off their trolleys with it. You've got, you know, people who are politicized within Islam, who think that they would need to run a caliphate, and they thought ISIS was the answer to all of that. You've got politicized version of Hinduism in Hindutva and Modiism and the stuff that's going on there, where they think somehow they're fighting some sort of weird international, you know, kind of tribal war from thousands of years ago. I mean, you've got politicization of Buddhism, and you've seen the kind of genocides that we've seen in places like Myanmar. So it's the politicization of religion, most often by men, most often for personal use, where we then see the problems. So I don't think it's the complexities. The second part of this is really interesting, and we found this in all the kind of work that we did with the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims. Anti-Muslim racism has got nothing to do with religiosity. So whether you get down on your knees and pray, whether you're a Sunni, you're a Shia, whatever you may believe in or don't believe in, is irrelevant. And it's often shown because of the number of Sikhs that get attacked. Because, you know, the great thing about racists is they're not usually very intelligent. And so they see a man in a turban and think, oh, Muslim, better beat him up. Or they see a temple or a gurdwara and think, oh, better firebomb that because that's a mosque. So there is no connection between Britain's lack of understanding about the complexities of a religion and the denominations with it, which, by the way, Britain's understanding of the complexities of Islam are probably on the same par as Britain's understanding of the complexities of Christianity in the UK. So I don't think that's the answer that's a great academic question, and there's fabulous academic departments that are having those questions. The question for us is, why are Muslims or their behavior seen as an extension of their religiosity, whereas everybody else's bad behavior is just seen as bad behavior? And why is Islam seen as a uniquely weird religion from overseas? Because unless somebody can kind of show me that Jesus was born in Leeds and, you know, Moses was born in Manchester, why are we vexed that Muhammad wasn't born in Bethnal Green, right? These were all alien religions, all of them from a similar place, all of them sons of Abraham, all of them actually from the same cultural context. We made them our own. So Anglicanism is British, English, Christianity. British Jews are British Jewry. British Islam is British Islam. We've always taken these faraway exotic religions and made them a version of our own. And, you know, I end on this is a fabulous thing that that great kind of thought leader on religion and Christianity, the West Wing. There's this fabulous moment in the West Wing where President Bartlett is asked about an extract from the Old Testament about burning, I think, your daughter or something, or homosexuality. And he kind of then goes on this rant about the Old Testament. And the modern version of that was two pranksters from the Netherlands who it's called the Quran experiment, you should look it up. And they took a copy of the Bible, they took the cover off it, and they quoted it in a cover of the Quran. And then they stood around on various street corners in Europe reading extracts on homosexuality, on women, on various other things, on what women wear, all sorts of things. And then they would say to people, what do you think of these verses? And they'd say, well, this is why it's a uniquely violent religion. It is very alien. It has no place in European society. And then they'd take the cover off it and say, you do realize it's the Bible. So any religious text taken out of context sounds slightly weird. So the question I ask is, let's deal with people as individuals. Let's not deal with them on a monolithic blog. Let's not judge them according to teachings of 1400 years ago, just like we don't judge anybody else. And let's draw a distinction between people of faith and religion and people who politicize religion for their own political ends.
Fantastic place to end. Can we please give Sayeeda a huge round of applause?